What actually keeps a society running? Have you ever stopped to think about why institutions like schools, governments, and economies just keep persisting across generations, seemingly with a life of their completely own? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're tackling one of the absolute most fundamental questions of human existence. We're looking at how millions of individual people, with all their own chaotic desires and conflicts, somehow manage to form a cohesive, functioning whole. It's a massive, sweeping question, right? And honestly, it requires a thinker with an equal amount of ambition to even try and answer it.
And that thinker is Talcott Parsons. He was an American sociologist who totally dominated the mid-20th century by attempting something almost unimaginably bold. He actually sought to build a massive theory of everything for society. He wanted a single, unified framework that could explain how literally any social system maintains its order and stability. But as you can probably guess, aiming that high makes you a very large target, and his highly ambitious theories eventually faced a fierce intellectual backlash. So today, we're going to explore the rise, the fall, and the enduring legacy of a true grand theorist. Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's a quick look at how we're going to unpack his massive body of work. First, we'll look at the architect of society. Second, his famous AGIL schema. Third, a really fascinating concept called playing the sick role. Fourth, the grand theory backlash. And finally, Parsons in the present. Starting off with part 1, the architect of society. Let's trace the roots of this sociological giant. You see, to really grasp Parsons' ambition to uncover the fundamental blueprint of human societies, we have to look at exactly where he came from. He wanted to know how societies survive, maintain order, and function, almost as if they were living, breathing biological organisms. And he didn't just build these theories out of thin air. He drew heavily on Emil Durkheim's ideas about social solidarity. He also famously translated the German sociologist Max Weber's groundbreaking work on modern institutions into English, which brought those massive ideas over to America. He even integrated Sigmund Freud's psychological theories on personality development. Parsons essentially took these enormous, somewhat disparate European ideas and wove them all together like a giant puzzle to build his own American theoretical foundation. Let's look at how this builds chronologically, because his background is super interesting. Parsons actually started out studying biology and philosophy at Amherst College back in 1924. And that biology background, that is absolutely crucial. It's exactly why he constantly used biological analogies, comparing society to a living organism with all these interconnected organs. He got his PhD in Heidelberg in 1927, which is where he first stumbled onto Weber's work. By 1930, he was among the very first instructors in Harvard's brand new sociology department, and he eventually reigned over Harvard sociology for decades, a tenure that culminated in his 1951 magnum opus, a massively influential book simply titled The Social System.
Now, you might be thinking Parsons was just sitting in some ivory tower dealing with abstract concepts. But actually, scratch that. During the late 1930s, having seen Weimar Germany firsthand, he became deeply alarmed by the rise of the Nazi Party. He was a passionate anti-Nazi activist. He helped organize the Harvard Defense Committee, and he even took to local radio stations to warn the American public, who, remember, were largely opposed to entering World War II at the time, that a Nazi victory would literally bring about a new dark age. He applied his understanding of social systems to actively fight against the breakdown of global democratic order. Moving right along to part 2, the AGIL schema explained. This is his universal blueprint for social survival. This brings us straight to the core engine of his entire framework. Parsons believed he had actually discovered the prerequisites that absolutely any society must meet if it wants to avoid collapsing. This overarching school of thought is called structural functionalism. Think of the human body for a second. You've got a heart, lungs, a brain. If just one of those fails, the whole system is in jeopardy, right? Well, Parsons viewed human society in the exact same way. It's a complex system of interconnected institutions, like the economy, the government, the family. Every single part has a specific, vital function that works to promote solidarity, equilibrium, and stability for the whole shebang. To explain exactly how this works, Parsons developed the AGIL schema. A-G-I-L. Let's break that down together. First up, A for adaptation. A society has to acquire resources from its environment to survive, and that function is handled by the economy. Next, G for goal attainment. Society needs to set collective objectives, which is the job of the political system. I is for integration. The different parts of society have to be coordinated to prevent conflict. The legal system and community norms take care of this.
And finally, L is for latency or pattern maintenance. A society must transmit its values and culture to the next generation. This vital function falls on the family, education, and religion. Parsons argued that if any of these four subsystems break down, the entire social organism is at serious risk. Which perfectly transitions us to part 3, playing the sick role. This is what happens when biology meets social obligation. Now, I know the AGIL schema sounds incredibly abstract, right? But Parsons brilliantly grounded it in something completely relatable to all of us: human illness. We all get sick. But how does society handle the fact that our biological bodies sometimes just fail? Well, Parsons argued that sociologically speaking, illness is actually a form of deviant behavior. Crazy, right? But think about it, because when you're sick, you can't fulfill your normal social roles. You can't go to work, you can't care for your family. You're actively deviating from the norm. Parsons realized that if too many people claimed illness, if we suddenly had a society full of what he called malingers, the whole economic and social system would just break down. So, to prevent a highly dysfunctional subculture of the sick from forming, society had to invent a strictly regulated sick role. And doctors? They are the ultimate gatekeepers to that role. This sick role is a deeply fascinating social contract, made up of very specific rights and obligations. Think about the last time you were really sick. What were your rights? Well, you're temporarily exempt from your normal duties, meaning you get to skip work without getting fired. And crucially, you aren't blamed for your illness. Society sees it as completely beyond your willpower. But those rights come with strings attached. You have strict obligations. You have to see being sick as undesirable, and you must try to get well quickly. Also, you're obligated to seek technically competent help, a doctor, and cooperate with them. If you don't actually try to get better, society simply revokes your rights as a sick person. Because the doctor is the gatekeeper holding back social collapse, Parsons defined an ideal role for them. Doctors are given high status, immense financial reward, and the autonomy to just do their jobs. They have the unique, socially granted right to physically examine you. But in return for all that power, they're obligated to be highly trained, completely objective, and motivated by community concern rather than just personal profit. It's a very paternalistic view, for sure. Drawing heavily on Freud, Parsons essentially saw the doctor-patient dynamic as a parent-child relationship, where the patient is expected to be passive, trusting, and totally cooperative with the authority figure in the white coat. All right, let's pivot to part 4, the grand theory backlash, the intellectual rebellion against Parsons.
For a solid chunk of the 20th century, Parsons' worldview was basically gospel. It was the absolute gold standard. But by the 1960s and 70s, an intellectual rebellion was brewing. A massive criticism industry emerged, signaling the end of his unquestioned dominance in sociology. And interestingly, the rebellion started from within. Robert K. Merton, who was actually a former student of Parsons, felt that his mentor's grand theory was simply way too abstract. It tried to explain the entire universe and ended up being almost impossible to test empirically. So Merton proposed middle-range theory instead. Rather than trying to map everything, Merton said we should look at specific, testable aspects of society. And crucially, Merton completely rejected Parsons' assumption that all institutions are inherently good for society. Merton introduced the idea of dysfunctions, pointing out that social structures can actually produce incredibly harmful or destabilizing consequences. And it wasn't just Merton. A massive wave of specific critiques hit Parsons from literally all sides. Marxist scholars, for instance, argued that Parsons completely ignored the profit motive. They pointed out that the medical establishment actually drives medicalization for corporate gain, and in some cases even induces illness. Then you had feminist critics pointing out that Parsons' model completely ignored female lay caring. They also noted that women are rarely afforded the right to just drop their normal social roles, like housekeeping or childbearing, when they fall ill. Meanwhile, interpretivists argued Parsons completely ignored the agency of the patient. I mean, people usually ask family or friends for advice long before they ever set foot in a doctor's office. They also pointed out, as sociologist Irving Goffman brilliantly did, that institutions like hospitals can actually strip away personal identity in a highly damaging way. But honestly, the most biting critique probably came from sociologist C. Wright Mills. He famously labeled Parsons' style as grand theory, and he meant it in a highly derogatory way. Mills and a whole new generation of sociologists felt Parsons' work was just overly complex, highly conservative, and heavily biased toward the status quo. To them, it felt completely untethered from the gritty, conflict-ridden social reality of the civil rights and anti-war eras. Parsons' neat little model of perfect equilibrium really struggled to explain an era defined by rapid social change and deep systemic inequality. Finally, let's look at part 5, Parsons in the present,
and the enduring legacy of structural functionalism.
So, with all of that heavy criticism, is Parsons just totally obsolete today? Well, the crucial point is this. Even if we reject his perfectly harmonious, conflict-free view of society, his foundational framework of systems thinking remains absolutely vital. Just take a modern example. The response to the recent COVID-19 pandemic can actually be brilliantly analyzed straight through Parsons' AGI-L lens. Think about it. To survive the disruption, the healthcare system had to radically adapt to manage scarce resources, fulfilling adaptation. Government policies had to quickly mobilize and set collective public health objectives. That's goal attainment. Community support networks had to step up to maintain social cohesion during intense lockdowns, representing integration. And our fundamental cultural norms around daily hygiene and personal space had to be rapidly updated and transmitted to everyone, satisfying latency. It shows exactly how interconnected social institutions literally must respond together to survive a massive crisis. Talcott Parsons actually had the audacity to look at all of humanity and try to draw the definitive wiring diagram for civilization itself. While his theories were heavily and rightfully critiqued for being too rigid and ignoring vital power dynamics, the fundamental questions he asked remain incredibly urgent. As we look at the sheer, overwhelming complexity of the 21st century, from global supply chains to international public health, I want to leave you with this to ponder. In our modern, increasingly fragmented world, do we still need a grand theory to make sense of it all? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.